my family's business was approached by a company that partners with Facebook. This was about 10 years ago. At that time, the presentation that they gave us, how they could help our business attract customers, told us that if somebody didn't have a Facebook account, if you didn't have a Facebook account, let's see how many of you have a Facebook account. At that time, 10 years ago, almost everybody in here has a Facebook account. Anybody not have a Facebook account? A few of you don't have a Facebook account. Do you have an Instagram account?
Yeah.
Anybody not have any social media accounts? Everybody has some kind of social media account. At that time, and Facebook owns a lot of these social media accounts. 10 years ago, if you had no social media accounts, Facebook had over 15,000 data points on the average person who had no social media accounts. They gather information constantly from publicly available databases, going through land record searches, title searches, buying information from banks and institutions. The rewards cards that you all have. How many of you have some kind of rewards card for airlines, for shopping, for something like that? All of that information is used. It's gathered, it's aggregated, and it's used. How do you think you get specific coupons? It was used in such a way that I read an article shortly after they did this presentation on how many data points they have on the average person who doesn't even have a Facebook account. Imagine how many data points they have if you have a Facebook account or you have an Instagram account, because they're constantly tracking where you are. When I went to buy my most recent plane, I've owned 2 planes now. This is the second one that I've owned. When I went to start looking for planes, we were in my mother's fairly new, it's a 2020 Cadillac XT5, and I was on the phone asking one of my friends if he wanted to go with me out to look at airplanes at Sundance. There were 2 people out there that had an airplane for sale that I was interested in. And after I hung up the phone, I had not asked Google or anything like that to find, I know where Sundance Airport is. I've been there a lot. And all of a sudden up on the screen pops directions to Sundance Airport. And this car starts giving me directions to Sundance. If you have, it's cool to have Alexa in your car, right? All of that information, they know where you're going. You click the acceptance on all of these apps that you use. How many of you use TripAdvisor or any of those kinds of, vacation apps? What's the one that does restaurants? I can't think of the name of it.
Yelp.
Yelp. Who said that? How many of you use Yelp? Lots of people use Yelp. Why? Because it's convenient. If you want to find something that's not a fast food chain in the area that you're around, they're monitoring where you go with that app. And we click through and we give them all of this information, and you can predict people's behavior. And so ethicists posit that maybe we're really influencing people in ways that they're not even aware of anymore. 15,000 data points of somebody who doesn't even have a Facebook. How many do they have today? Yes.
What about, well, it's happened to me whenever, like for example, one time I was talking about like dog food.
Mhm.
And then whenever I got like on Instagram or Facebook, it was on my newsfeed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, you click on the accept and it'll ask you whether or not you want to allow it to track you. And it'll say always or just when using the app. And most of us don't even think about it. We just click it and we accept and we move on. And the next thing you know, on your newsfeed, I mean, when I first got a Facebook account years and years and years ago, I did it because when I first started teaching here, I was 22 years old. I was younger than most of my students at that time. The average age of our freshmen was 29 years old. I think I've told you all this before. And as I got older, I started to notice that my students, didn't think my jokes were quite as funny. And so I got on, Facebook and MySpace back in the day. I don't even know if MySpace is still around. I think it actually is. Vine is actually not around. It actually the platform completely went away. But, to sort of be kind of relevant. And if you change all of the stuff in your, at that point, I was just fascinated because I changed from being single to in a relationship, and all of the ads for dating disappeared. And then when I got a divorce, I put it back to single, and all of a sudden, all of the Jewish dating ads started appearing. That was very basic technology. I mean, that's far more sophisticated because now the ads that I get are far more targeted by things that I have not even posted on Facebook or said. So yeah, I mean, it's, the artificial intelligence is getting better and better and better with just astronomical amounts of orders of magnitude in being able to predict these things.
It's starting to notice what apps I open whenever I go to specific places. So I use this one app whenever I grocery shop. And whenever I start to pull down to search for the apps, whenever I pull up to Crest, it immediately puts that app right at the top.
Right.
And it's so funny, it starts to know where I go from specific places. So if I go to directions to go from say here to somewhere, it knows usually where I'm gonna go. It'll put it there.
I have never told the Maps app, I've never plugged in this is my home address. It knows when, it'll say, 23 minutes to home. I mean, I know where my home is. I'm not that, much of an absent-minded college professor that I don't know where my home is. It will tell, parked car updated because it knows when I get out of my car, and so that you can locate your car. I mean, it's incredible, and that's useful, isn't it? I mean, how many times have you been in, for example, a big parking lot? Every year, one of the things that we do, one of the competitions that we participate in is called the International Collegiate Sales Competition. That one's always held in Orlando. I think I've told you all this. As part of that trip, we get to go to Disney with the competition pays. At the end of it, the reward for participating in the competition, and the competition pays for it, is for all of us to go to Disney, the faculty members and the students. And it's great. You get to choose any one of the parks that you want to go to. They don't pay for the multi-park hopper, so you have to kind of select which one you want to go to. And the resort we stay at is far enough out that we always have to take a car, and it will tell me where my car is. In the past, so we've gone to Disney every year. I used to take pictures of where I parked the car in the parking lot so that I'd remember. I don't have to do that anymore because it tells me parked car has been, updated on the Maps app automatically. And so it's helpful to find a car, but it's also a little creepy. Now, a lot of people, and when I used to teach, because I was a lawyer before I became a marketing professor, when I used to teach criminal law and procedure, all that class was full of police officers or wannabe police officers. And of course, their response is, well, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to worry about. That's not necessarily the point. As I think Alessandro Acquisti points out, that it's not about having something to hide. It's about, is the will overborne? Is the right to privacy actually a constitutional right? You're shaking your head yes.
Not in
Yes.
US. Not in the US, is it?
Oh, it is. Yeah. Where's the word privacy found in the Constitution? It's one of them. The word privacy is actually not found in the Constitution. In a case called Griswold versus Connecticut in 1965, Justice Douglas creates the concept and says that it's found in the penumbras and emanations of the Bill of Rights. So the Bill of Rights contains the first You're the one who said the First Amendment, right? The Bill of Rights contains the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. They were all adopted at the same time, shortly after the ratification of the US Constitution. There was a big debate. A lot of states were very apprehensive about adopting the Constitution because they thought that it gave the federal government too much power. Prior to the Constitution, we had something called the Articles of Confederation, which was a very loose association of sovereign states. So when we talk about relationships of national governments to sub-national units, you can have three sort of types of government. The most common type of government is what we call a unitary system of government, in which all power is derived from the national government, and subunits of government can be destroyed by that national unit. At the other end is called a confederation, which is what we had. A confederation. This is a loose association. There are examples of confederations today. The Queen of England is technically the Queen of Australia. She's the Queen of Canada. She's the Queen of the Bahamas. She's the Queen of all of these independent states that loosely affiliate with what's called the Commonwealth. But you know, they could stop at any time, and some of the countries have. A lot of the sub-Saharan African countries that were colonized by the British broke all ties and decided they didn't want to be part of the Commonwealth. Now, there are advantages to being part of the Commonwealth. One of those advantages, for example, is in Jamaica, where the Queen is she's the sovereign of Jamaica. Those people can go to Canada and get citizenship fairly easily. So I used to have this business where we recruited nurses to come across, because when they passed the North American Free Trade Agreement, you could bring certain professions in which there was a shortage across the three countries, Mexico, Canada, and the United States, more easily than you could before, and get them on what was called an H-1B visa. Well, all of the nurses we recruited in Canada were largely from Jamaica. And they wanted to go, all of the hospitals that we had that were our clients were largely located in Florida and the South. If you're from Jamaica, Canada is the exact opposite of what you're used to in terms of weather and climate. It's cold, it's miserable. They could go to Canada, they could get Canadian citizenship within a year at that time, and then they could come across to the United States on an H-1B visa. So there are advantages to being part of the Commonwealth. But in theory, Canada could say, we're going to, go our own way, and we're going to abandon the Queen, and we're not going to be part of that Commonwealth. All power resides, all sovereign power really resides with the subunits of government. In a middle ground is what we call a federal system, which is what we have in the United States. And this is an example of how the regulatory environment impacts marketing. So in Griswold versus Connecticut, the state of Connecticut, like many states at the time in the 1950s and 60s, had laws prohibiting the use, distribution, possession, or promotion of contraceptives. They didn't allow married couples to basically engage in family planning. The use of things like condoms. You couldn't sell, promote, possess these kinds of devices, birth control, in the state. In that opinion, in Griswold versus Connecticut, Justice Douglas says that in the penumbras and emanations of the United States Constitution, there is an idea of privacy. The penumbra is a term that he borrows from the physical sciences. The penumbra is what happens when you have a solar eclipse. As the moon moves in front of the sun, if you've ever seen a solar eclipse, there's a halo, a shadow effect around it. That's the penumbra. And he says that you find these ideas of the right to privacy in the First Amendment to the Constitution, which contains 5 substantive rights: freedom of speech, press, religion, petition of government for redress of grievances, and assembly. And he says that implies that you have a right of privacy. This idea of freedom of speech. It also means that you have the freedom to express yourself or not express yourself. In the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution, the Third Amendment to the United States Constitution. Nobody really remembers the Third Amendment. I think that's the one about quartering soldiers. And he says that implies a right to privacy. In the Fifth Amendment, the prohibition against self-incrimination implies a right to privacy. And he says, taken all together, you have this. So it's not mentioned anywhere in the Constitution. The effect of this is that it allowed for marketers to be able to sell, distribute, and promote products like, birth control. The progeny of Griswold has been one of the most controversial decisions that the Supreme Court ever came up with, which was called Roe versus Wade in 1973. That's the case that legalized abortion based on this idea of the right to privacy. So we have this idea of a right to privacy, but I think what Akisti's arguing is that, we have this idea that you have this right to privacy, but we really, in a modern era, don't have much privacy. Years and years and years ago, when I first started teaching marketing, before the internet became the pervasive tool that it is today, we're all constantly connected to this tool. At that point in time, the average American was photographed something like 70 times a day without even knowing it. You were photographed every time you walked past an ATM machine, every time you went into a convenience store, every time you went into a bank, every time you went into Walmart. There are multiple cameras. How many times do you think that happens now? It's far more. Cameras are literally almost everywhere. One of the most damning pieces of evidence against Timothy McVeigh in the Oklahoma City bombing was a surveillance camera right across the street. So we have this constitutional right to privacy, but we've given it up in many respects. And that's allowed us as marketers to really engage in very sophisticated, highly scientific micro-targeting of individuals. It's no longer that as political marketers, for example, when I first started running campaigns, you would go down to the election board and you'd get lists of, if you were a Democrat, of the Democrat, or if you're a Republican, they have them broken out, and you'd get these lists and you'd send out letters to everybody on the list. We now have the ability to engage in very specific marketing campaigns or disinformation campaigns, if you will, based on people's online, what they're watching and thinking online. This has allowed other nations like Russia to engage in, basically, in the political marketplace, the voter is the consumer. To engage in very specific target marketing using bots and trolls. What's the difference between a bot and a troll? A bot is artificial intelligence that reposts things that it thinks that you might be interested in. When you pull up your web browser on your phone to look at stuff, it automatically directs you to pages that you've liked before. That's predictive, browsing. A troll is somebody who actually is, they have this company in Russia that actually engages, they attempt to sound like or be like Americans and repost and make comments on political things. And it was enormously effective. I'm not taking a political stand here, but the simple fact of the matter is that there is overwhelming evidence that the Russians preferred Donald Trump to Hillary Clinton, and that they engaged in this kind of misinformation. They reposted things about a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. that they said that the Clintons were using as an underground child sex ring. And as a result of that, some guy went and shot up this pizza parlor. I mean, this kind of disinformation can be enormously effective. So we can predict these things and we can manipulate them in very sort of scientific ways, and not necessarily for the better good all the time. So it's one of those things that we have to think about what we can do in terms of the regulatory when we talk about environmental scanning, the regulatory, and then the ethical implications of these kinds of really unique technologies. In the past, we used to say as marketers, if you really made a customer mad, they would tell 7 people. If they really liked you, they might tell 3. That's no longer the case. If they don't like you, they will tell the world. They will get on TripAdvisor. They will get on Yelp. They will get, and they will tell everybody. And they will engage in negative word of mouth. And those kinds of comments using algorithms are the ones that oftentimes pop up at the top of the review. And then Yelp uses that to try and, by the way, shake down businesses, to try and get you to, they will help you improve your reviews, right? So we've got this rational actor model, this irrational actor model. What would be the synthesis? Well, it's a combination of the rational and the irrational, and it's predicated on risk. If we are engaged in high risk types of decisions, the model says we're more likely to engage in a rational actor behavior rather than an irrational actor behavior. What are high risk decisions? Things like housing. When you buy a house, you're more likely to engage in rational actor, according to this idea of the synthesis, that's a big decision. That's a 30-year mortgage, although I'm not so sure that we do engage in this. I think I've told you this story before. Because I'm a lawyer and I used to teach legal environment of business, from time to time I would have students come up to me and they'd say, Dr. Aguirre, we remember that there are various ways you can take title to homes. And my girlfriend and I, or my boyfriend and I, are thinking about buying a home together. And I'd say, why aren't you married? We just don't think we're ready for that level of commitment yet. You're ready to take on $250,000 debt and a 30-year mortgage, but you're not ready for marriage. The best thing about marriage is divorce. It's a very efficient way when you decide that you no longer want to be together of dividing things like your house up. So if you're married in Oklahoma, you can take title by the entirety, which means only married couples can do this. It's a special provision. It creates special kinds of protections for each of those spouses. Otherwise, if you're not married, you have to take title either as joint tenants or tenants in common. And there are advantages and disadvantages to either of those. If you take title as joint tenants, when you die, your half will pass to the other joint tenant. If you pass as tenants in common, your half will pass to your heirs and assigns, either through will or through intestacy. Now, why do I point this out? Because we think that we would be rational in housing, and people are somewhat rational. But I can give you an example. When my mother was a realtor, she had a big real estate company, and she went in, she was one of the first to do this. This was back in the late 1960s and early 1970s. She was one of the first real estate companies to really come up with a very scientific method of going through and evaluating a house and telling homeowners what they should do if they wanted to market their house, to stage housing. Nobody did that back then, really. She sort of was on the cutting edge of doing this, staging houses and going through and telling people things like, if we're in springtime, you need to get rid of all of those winter clothes because closets look bigger if they aren't jam-packed full. And also, all of that stuff, your clothing, you don't realize it because you become, as the commercial for Febreze suggests, nose blind to all of these conditions in your house. Clothing doesn't smell great after a while. It gets kind of damp and it gets a little musty, and And you may not notice it, but other people will. So you got to clean out the closets, get all of that out, vacuum so that you get all of those dust bunnies and things like that, hold moisture and affect the smell of your house. And so, you know, take down as many personal photos because people don't want to see your personal photos. They want to picture themselves in the house. And so we went through this one house and she was telling the people, we've got to replace the carpet. And they said, we're just going to give them a carpeting allowance of $5,000. My mother said, fine, I'm telling you that people, they don't see past that. And they would come in the house. We had several open houses because that was, again, back in the 1970s. I don't think open houses today are terribly effective. I don't know why realtors still do them. I don't think they're terribly effective as a marketing tool. A lot of younger realtors will still do them for older realtors because they think it's a way of contacting people and building a client base and getting leads and stuff like that. And I guess that's okay. But in the 1970s, people still did this. They still, you know, they had what was called the multi-list, and people would drive around neighborhoods. You'd have open houses, and people would walk in this house and they'd say, you know, the house down the street's got new carpet. And we'd say, but you get a $5,000 allowance. Wouldn't you rather have carpet that you want rather than at that point in time, all carpet was beige? The new among your generation is you don't want beige. Everything's gray or white. I mean, it's like all these, you know, off-white or gray. Gray is the new beige. And finally, she convinced them that they just needed to change the carpet after the house didn't sell after 90 days and they were moving. Because her husband had been transferred, they finally changed the carpet and the house sold in 2 days. Because people just can't see. Now that's an example. If you're rational, if you're completely using a rational actor model in purchasing a house, what would you do? You would want to be able to select your own carpet rather than select the carpet that's neutral that everybody else has selected for you. Automobiles are another one that we think of as being higher risk. That's probably the second largest purchase that most people will make. Your house is your first, your automobile is the second. Major appliances, things like refrigerators, washers, dryers, things like that cost a lot of money. Low risk things, what do we usually do? Why do you use the shampoo that you use? Why do you use the toothpaste that you use? Probably I would guess that you use the toothpaste that your parents used. You didn't engage. Did you read all of the ingredients in the toothpaste? Do you know what's in there? Do you know what it does? Does it do what it says it does? When they say things like, do you watch the claims where they say 4 out of 5 dentists recommend? Well, did you engage in a rational analysis of that and start asking, where'd you find the dentists? Tylenol used to do this. They used to say the #1 recommended pain reliever by hospitals across America. You know why it was the #1 recommended pain reliever by hospitals? Because Tylenol gave it to them for free. And they then charged you. Hospitals charge you for everything. You go through the hospital bill. My aunt just had open heart surgery. She had a heart attack. She had a quadruple bypass. She's still in the hospital. They gave her this teddy bear. You look at the bill, that's called a cough support device. That sounds like a really important thing. It's a pillow or a teddy bear that you can hug to help relieve the pain of having your chest cracked open. So they charge. They got, you know, why are they giving you the Tylenol? Why are they recommending it? Well, because they got it for free. So the synthesis model says that with regard to things like that, we don't really think about them that much. We don't think about the research. You know, when it says 4 out of 5 dentists, did you pay the dentists? Did you give the dentist, you know, the toothpaste for free? Why is it that dentists give you these little bags with toothbrushes and toothpaste? They get that toothpaste for free. It's so that you'll try it as a sample and then maybe you'll use it. What are the influences that influence our purchasing decisions? Sociocultural influences. There's lots of things that we do in this country because we are influenced by sort of the cultural norms that surround us. We buy all sorts of things that are predicated on these ideas that have been part of an organic formation of our culture. Again, when I used to teach political science, I think I told you all this before, but it illustrates this point again, that I used to have my students write a paper called My American Dream. And the reason that I had them write this paper is because the American dream is deeply ingrained in the American psyche. By the way, when I was a foreign exchange student in Germany, nobody would say this in other countries. They don't say, my German dream. They don't. They don't say, my Canadian dream in Canada. This is something that is really uniquely American. And it's different here than it is in other places. Still, to this day, when you ask people about their American dream, when we do polls on this, even though people say things like it used to be, I want to get married and I want to have kids and things like that, now you've got lots of couples that, I mean, back in the 1970s and 80s, no one would have fathomed, no one would have said, if you were gay, my dream is to marry another man. That was just not a choice. That wasn't an option for you, right? The American dream was to get married and have kids and buy a house. That part of the dream is still a big part of it. Most people in this country want to buy a house. That is a big part of our American culture. That is not a big deal in other cultures. When I was in Germany, most people don't own their own homes. They largely rent. It's a small country. This idea of owning a little plot of ground is really uniquely American in many respects. People don't think about that in other places because it's expensive. England, it's a tiny country. It's an island. It's expensive to buy things there. So that idea of home ownership is not necessarily as ingrained in those cultures as it is in the United States. The only place that you find that is not part of what people say their American dream is if they live in places like New York City. Most people can never afford. This business that I told you that I had, we had a partner in the business who lived in New York City. She was 66 years old, and she had just bought her first condo in a co-op. And she came here and she couldn't believe when she saw my house. She had paid $1.5 million for a 2-bedroom, 1-bath, 950 square foot condo in New York City. And she came to my house. I had a 3-bedroom, 2 full bath, huge kitchen, formal dining room, living room in a historic home in Edgemere Park. And I paid $125,000 for it. She was like, how many millions of dollars? It had a huge lot, sat on a corner. She's like, how many millions of dollars did you pay? I'm like, I paid $125,000 for this. People in New York City can't fathom because they live in small spaces. But other than places like that, other than places like New York and Chicago, most people, this idea of home ownership is really a part of it. And that's part of our sociocultural influences. Friends and family also influence what we buy and how we feel about things. Brands of cars. When I was growing up in Oklahoma, most people growing up in a small town, most people drove trucks, and we actually use our trucks. It's amazing to me how many of you drive a truck and live in an apartment. Why? Because it's cool. But people were committed Ford or Chevy. There's a huge divide there. Psychological factors, and then psychographics. You should go here. This is on D2L. You can find this. Go to Strategic Business Insights, and we'll talk about that. You can take the VALS test, which is one of the big ways of predicting the way people will behave. We'll finish this. Next time, we'll talk about psychographics, and then we will move into organizational behavior. Next week, I only have 1 chapter scheduled, so we should be able to get caught up, hopefully, by then. I will stop the live feed and then do the